And so now I would love to introduce the next panel, and particularly our next facilitator of the panel, Mayra Alvarez. She is currently the president of the Children's Partnership, as well as the First Five California Commissioner and an Early Childhood Policy Council member. And moreover, she is a passionate leader with deep policy expertise and commitment to uplifting the lives of our children and their families. And she'll be facilitating our next panel focused on advancing equity through whole child approaches across the B-12 system. Mayra, thank you for being here with us.
Thank you for the opportunity to join you and to moderate this incredible discussion. I will say I had the pleasure of hearing Gabby and Stephanie's conversation and was incredibly moved by that discussion. So just want to say thank you for allowing me to be in that space with them. Really appreciate that. So good afternoon, everybody. Again, my name is Mayra Alvarez. I'm president of the Children's Partnership, and I want to thank the Advancement Project team for inviting me to be part of this important conversation. I am honored to serve as the moderator for today's important discussion on how we can advance equity through whole child approaches across the birth through 12 system. For those of us that have been part of this conference and these discussions thus far, these conversations have really shown light on the challenges facing families and what it's really going to take to support the well-being of children and young people across our state, and in particular, our Black and Brown students and young children. Our conversation today will build on those discussions and push us further into the space of intersectionality, the complexity of families' lives, and the multiple issues impacting the development of their children. So as we discuss whole child approaches, I want to invite us to remember what Gabby told us. We are here to build community with one another. That's what we're talking about when we say a whole child, whole family approach. And today's panel will help us all understand various programs that break down silos, that build bridges across systems, all to support children and families and helping them thrive, particularly our children of color and their families, and those in the most under-resourced and historically marginalized communities. And in doing so, we can chart the path to transform our communities for the advancement of our young people. And we have a great group of panelists to help us bring this conversation to life. And before I briefly introduce them, I want to let our audience know that you can submit questions to panelists in the chat. And we're going to incorporate the questions into the discussion as much as possible as we track the conversation. And what we can, we'll also address during our discussion at the end. So let's introduce our panel. I want to start by saying my short introductions will not do their leadership justice. So I encourage you to visit the website for full panelist bios. So with us today, we've got three great speakers. First, we have Dr. Anya Hurwitz, who is the Executive Director of the Sobrato Early Academic Language Model. Anya is the Executive Director of SEAL and is focused on supporting English learners and dual language learners in California, building on her career of supporting public schools to meet the diverse needs of their students' academic and social-emotional development. We also have Joel Scott. He is the Partnership Director at Turnaround for Children. Joel is in the New York region. He delivers professional learning supports to leaders, principals, and their teams, leveraging his experience as an educator and an instructional coach. And then finally, we have Jonathan Barnett Tugbenyoh, Director of School Partnerships with Seneca Family of Agencies. He oversees school-based programs in the Bay Area from early childhood through high school and leads with his expertise in school-based mental health. So to the three of you, thank you for being with us and engaging in this important conversation. So I'm going to start us off. We're going to head right into the discussion. And with this opening question, really want to hear from each of our panelists about their perspectives on this whole child equity approach. As I mentioned in my opening comments, this whole child equity approach really recognizes that a child's development and their well-being across the birth through 12 system is embedded in the healthy functioning of their family, as well as the healthy functioning of the community in which they live. This often requires meeting multiple complex needs of families, as I mentioned, nutrition, housing, health, education, in order to support that child's healthy development. Can you, each of you, take a moment and share how your work to provide holistic whole child supports for children and families involves bridging and coordinating these various systems, and how that systems alignment work has impacted the communities you serve. Dr. Hurwitz, let's start with you.
Thank you, Mayra. Great to be here, and an honor to be with my fellow panelists. So SEAL is a nonprofit organization dedicated to centralizing the needs of English learners and dual language learners in California. Our approach is rooted at the intersection of research and educational equity. We equip educators and school communities with effective research-based strategies, tools, and professional learning. Our goal is to combat educational inequity and opportunity gaps by working to provide English learners and dual language learners with asset-based, culturally and linguistically relevant and affirming education systems so that they can learn, thrive, and lead. So the SEAL model is a whole school systems change approach. We work across all levels: teachers, families, coaches, principals, district leaders, to bring forth joyful, intellectually engaging, culturally and linguistically affirming learning for all children. So that's really at the core of our whole child approach, the understanding that schools must be culturally and linguistically affirming and asset-based, that learning across all content areas, all elements of schooling must be culturally and linguistically affirming and asset-based. And that language is the vehicle of all learning for all children. So when you build language-rich classrooms that embed rich, powerful language development in and across everything, it supports all children to learn and thrive. And of course, language and culture are inextricable. So when you build a classroom and classrooms that truly honor and affirm all the diverse languages and cultures within it, children thrive. Additionally, language and culture are extremely important elements of identity and socio-emotional health. So again, that's core to how we think about SEAL as a whole child approach. Another element of the way we embody this notion of whole child is related to a very deep and strong commitment to the intellectual capacity of all children, that our schools, that school for all children should be engaging, interesting, and give them access to the full curriculum. Far too many poor children, too many Black and brown children end up in classrooms where learning is reduced to discrete skill-based approaches, where the only subjects that get real focus are math and reading. And those are for monolingual approaches to teaching math and reading. Meanwhile, professional, middle, and upper income families would never accept that for their children. So it's amazing what can happen to a school culture when it shifts to a systemic focus on deeply engaging learning, intellectually engaging learning that is language rich. Time and time again, our partners tell us that their discipline issues decrease significantly. Why? Because the children aren't bored, truly. And research confirms that bored Black and brown children are perceived quite differently than that of their white peers, right? And that boredom is treated as misbehavior that requires discipline. So additionally, when schools shift to focusing on deeply engaging learning that is language rich, teachers also become invigorated. And we've had many teachers who implement the SEAL model decide not to retire because their love of teaching was reignited. And if the pandemic has taught us anything, it is that the socio-emotional health of everyone in the schoolhouse and in the community is critical. So embodying a whole child approach also means for us at SEAL attending to the needs and the assets of educators. And then I'll just end with two quotes, which are included in our recent evaluation briefs of our replication of the model that bring these points to life. The first is a principal who just noted students are more engaged. I've noticed higher levels of vocabulary in student conversations, and parents are connected. And then the second is from a teacher that says, SEAL has given me the license to allow exploration, artistic expression, noise, and to embrace the style of teaching that came naturally to me. Thank you.
Joel or Jonathan, you want to jump in here?
I'm happy to. That's a tough act to follow, but again, so privileged to be speaking here with you all and engage in this conversation. I'm with Seneca, which, like myself, was an 80s baby, born here in the Bay Area in the mid 80s. And we're now privileged to serve kids and families across California and in Washington State as well. And I support 12 schools here in San Francisco and the Peninsula. And I think what I've learned in this work is that schools, we all know, are the first responders pretty much all the time, right? And I think what they don't get enough credit for often is that they have embedded expertise across all these fields: health, social, emotional. Teachers are used to playing nurse, playing lawyer, playing just about everything. So you get a bunch of educators around the table and you can solve, man, just about any problem. I think what's often lacking, and Anya and I had a chance to nerd out a little bit about this at a prior discussion, are the systems for coordinating both data collection and the collaboration and coordination of resources to solve these problems. Schools have Dorothy's red slippers, right? They have the answer to a lot of the issues impacting their kids and families. What they need are the tools to come together and bring the services and interventions to kids at an early stage. I loved that poll, and it warmed my heart to see early childhood take the cake. I'm not gonna lie, I was clicking that social emotional button, and then I saw panelists weren't allowed to vote, and I was like, no, social emotional. But it is also important, and I think what Seneca has really shifted to focusing on is early detection and coordination of resources for kids and families. One example of that is, and we're not unique here, we have a universal social emotional screening tool. Our schools are the bomb at collecting academic data and really having a sense of where their kids are doing, as Anya said, in math and reading. But when it comes to their abilities around connecting with their peers, navigating feelings of anger, advocating for their own needs in the classroom, oftentimes we don't have a sense of school-wide how we're doing in those skills and how each individual child is building those capacities in themselves. And so we support schools in collecting this data and then analyzing it to see, and this is another thing Anya and I were talking about before, is it's one thing to collect the data at the early childhood level. You know, we have our ASQSE is a commonly used tool where we are collecting social emotional data on a lot of our students or a lot of our children, and then not really knowing exactly what to do with it. So I think it's getting these systems together for data collection, data analysis, and then how am I going to leverage the resources within my building to address the needs illuminated in the data? And how am I going to continue to, utilizing both qualitative and quantitative data, assess the progress being made so I know, is what I just did for 8 weeks to support this child and family effective and moving the needle for them? Or do I need to go back to the drawing board? So that's really a big focus that we've been looking at. And oftentimes there are people within our school buildings that have amazing relationships already with different providers in the community. It's getting those people to leverage those relationships so that we can have particularly the planning conversations for children with more intensive needs with our community partners as well, and not be trying to solve everything on our own. So that's what I got, long and short, and I'll kick it over to Joel.
Thank you so much. At Turnaround for Children, we've been very much focused on the science of learning and development and 5 core principles coming from that. So the first is development is bidirectional. So there's this ongoing dynamic interaction between nature and nurture. And if you've ever taken like a Psych 101 class, this was always the conversation, right? Is it nature? Is it nurture? What happens if we put children in this particular setting? What will happen? And what we found is that it's a little bit of both. And how do we then attune ourselves to create these spaces for children in which they can thrive, but also keep their bodies and their biology in a place where they can actually take advantage of that space? Also mindful of not weaponizing science too, right? Because we've seen that throughout the course of history, how science is weaponized. So we want to make sure that when we are talking about the science of learning and development, it's how we can actually support students in how they're going to be successful inside of school and outside of school. That second core principle is that context matters. So the malleable nature of development is both an opportunity and a vulnerability, depending on the context. So if I had to turn this into a number sentence, because I did teach K-6 for quite a long time, your experiences plus your environment plus your relationships are equal to your context. And sometimes when we talk about context with school leaders, they'll say, well, it's very safe here. That's great, but like, are we talking about the relationships? Are we talking about the environment? Or are you talking about the experiences that you're giving these students? And they're like, oh, well, there's layers to this. And I said, yes, the context is just not the building in which they're going into. It's all these other elements. So how do we then identify and understand what the context is so then we can start building out those equity frameworks in which those students can thrive? The third thing is learning is integrated. Learning isn't academic or just social and emotional, right? Students are becoming increasingly capable of complex skills, and there's this integration of cognitive, social, and emotional development. Even us as people, as the adults who are supporting them, if we wake up on the wrong side of the bed and do not have our coffee, and then we walk into the building and we might be a little short, that is an example of integration, right? My morning did not start well. Maybe it gets better throughout the course of the day. And it's the same thing for students. Whatever they're learning and going through, it's all being woven together in their brains. Pathways are also unique, that there's no such thing as an average student. Everyone has their own individual trajectory. There are probably these points in your life where there are pauses or pendings, and then there are other times where you're just sprinting, right? Every pathway is unique for a student, so we have to keep that in mind. And last but not least, student voice being super critical. How do we actually listen to students? And just me coming from a very strict West Indian background, right? My parents never very much asked questions, nor did they tell me when I should go to school. Should I ask questions? It was whatever your teacher says, that's what you're going to do. And if you did different, you were wrong. And I think because you are in a space where you don't get to advocate for yourself, you don't even feel the equity practices that are being implemented for you, right? Like you need to advocate for yourself. So we always want to make sure that we're including student voice. An example of how we've been trying to go about creating more equity in schools is our tiered support project. So we were looking at the traditional MTSS supports that we have in schools, which now coming out of this pandemic, but that's, I don't know how true that is. The need for tiered supports in MTSS is very real, right? I think we forget that the students that we have, our Black and Brown students, they've been hardest hit, but also you don't even have the ability to grieve, right? I've suffered some levels of loss, and just to sit in my apartment and to just grieve by myself has not felt good, right? So how do we expect little people who are just building out those strengths to do that on their own? So for our tiered supports project, we looked at regular MTSS, and we thought about, is this an actual equitable system that's supposed to be supporting our kids who need it the most? And, you know, there are some things in there that just aren't good feeling. Supports are addressed separately. Students are considered in terms of their deficits, and therefore they're problematized, right? Like, we're going to sit here and we're going to talk about how problematic this child is. And we're going to do that in front of their family, because that's going to make them feel great. And you understand that this isn't necessarily the way to go about things. And then we look at the student's behavior as opposed to the systems that we're trying to create from the teacher lens, from a systemic lens, like, all right, well, if he has this particular problem or she has this particular problem, how are we looking at ourselves as the root of that, and then building out the systems and structures to support them? So our tiered supports project, we grounded that into the science of learning development, acknowledges the impact of trauma. It's adjusted to individual practice, and it really looks at like school-wide systems and those protocols for how we're treating students. It's designed with an equity lens, but also an equity outcome, right? That's what we're actually aiming for. And we want to prioritize student context to help them deepen their understanding, and then also to center the school community and the home, because when we do have these meetings and we do bring in the community members and we bring in the families, it feels that they're almost like bystanders, but they're the people who are most impacted by the work that we're doing right now, like literally in front of them. So if we could, in our tiered supports project, which you can find on our website, and I'm sure it'll be in the post-conference communications, there is a whole plan and approach to how you're actually going to build out a tier support for students that centers them and their families, as opposed to the problematized behaviors and ideas that people have been holding on to for such a very long time.
So each of you, I think, threw out critical components of what whole child approaches look like, right? Anya, you spoke about culture and how inextricably linked it is to language and to identity, particularly for children, starting at young children. Jonathan, you talked about relationships and how schools have to have strong relationships with others in the community in order to support their young people. Joel, you specifically talked about student voice and what that means to have that agency and to respect that agency of our young people in making these spaces safe on the various levels that you talked about. But each of you are representing your programs, right? How do we ensure that these elements, which to Joel's point, is what makes systemic change possible, these core elements, integrating these core elements and not one-off programs. How do we ensure that these are not just limited to U3 and the schools you directly touch, but that there's an opportunity for more schools, for more early learning centers, for more childcare programs to integrate these components and serve all of our children better? And I wanna highlight for you, not just for our students in K through 12, but also, Jonathan, to your point, our earliest learners, our young ones. Who wants to take that one on or start?
I'm happy to start. I love the babies. We have our for Joel, just saying all my favorite songs. So I've really appreciated hearing you talk about multi-tier systems of supports. We have really been seeking to bring that model to the early childhood space. And have been working with other folks in the mental health field who partner with Head Starts in San Francisco to be thinking about how to leverage mental health consultant time, not just when children and families are at a point of failing and being sent to more intensive settings, but to extend that support earlier on and to use the data that we're collecting to develop early interventions. And so what that looks like is having our early educators on a rotating schedule where we get folks in to talk about all the children in their rooms and where they're thriving or thriving, whichever you prefer. Joel, I loved your focus on strengths-based assessment. So many of the assessments that we use from the social emotional lens are deficit-based. I can share my screen real quick and show how we've sort of tried to flip that approach. This is a strengths-based social emotional assessment that we've begun using. And is it tiny? Mayra, I see you leaning in. I'm like, is it super small? Oh no. But this is a way that we can look at a set of skills from a strengths-based lens across a school community. So you can see here, plays or works well with others and positive and stable mood were key strengths for this school community. Whereas ability to manage high energy and impulses and ability to focus and pay attention are opportunities for growth. And meanwhile, this is a TK through third grade school. Are there any children in this grade level band that came back after the pandemic excelling in those areas? Absolutely not. And so some of this is normalizing for our early childhood educators. Look, we're going to see this for a little while. And that's not to say that there's nothing we can do about it. There's always something we can do about it. And we really got to meet our babies where they're at right now. And so using these data collection tools, these frequently recurring collaboration opportunities to be looking at the small moves to more intensive interventions and everything in between that our early childhood educators can be using to move the needle with our kiddos.
So I can jump in and just say, I think with regards to kind of ensuring that we see this happening across the board, I think that was at the core of your question, Myra. In California, to your point about early learning, 60% of children 0 to 5 speak a language other than English at home. So it's so critical that we're really clear about who are the children we're serving. And then what does it mean to center their needs and think whole child about their needs. And I think, what you're hearing the three of us talk, we all come at this notion of whole child with different lenses and ways of entering. And there are a lot of different ways to embrace the notion of whole child. And yet there are some kind of centering spaces and ways that we need, and again, in particular in California. So the English Learner Roadmap policy is one that is research-based, that's statewide, that's meant to be aligning preschool through 12. And so my charge to our state leaders, our policy leaders, and our local leaders, as well as community stakeholders and advocates, is to really think about what does the English learner policy mean for me in my work, and what does it mean to embed this framework of it, really an acknowledgement of who our children, the children we serve, the communities we serve are, and using an asset-based or an affirming approach, a strength-based, a funds of knowledge approach that embraces all the children, but definitely acknowledges, the explicit diversities, right? And moves away from talking about equity in general terms that don't get us down to some of the specific approaches that we know are research-based and that really are needed and are make or break for certain children.
I think for some of what I've experienced here in New York City, we need to figure out, one, what are we actually defining when we talk about equity and scale and things of that nature? Because sometimes when I have conversations with people about equity, I'm like, you're talking about equality. That's not equity, right? And then there's this whole discussion back and forth around, what are you saying, right? And then we have to level set on our understanding. The second piece of this is also the mindset shift around what does it actually look like when a whole child is thriving in your school? Do you have markers around that idea? Do you know what you are actually looking for? Because it just can't be test scores, right? This is a vast and open world in which people are developing new ideas, new things. When schools were created, they didn't burn and included. I wasn't included in the mastermind of this whole process, right? No one was concerned about my level of education. And for the most part, we were trying to put children into factories. So what does it look like when a whole child is thriving? And do we actually go about that work of mindset changing? And then can we get those policymakers, district leaders, teachers, and everyone to buy in, because everyone's so used to that old model and that old way of thinking. And I think if we were to have everybody on board, then you could actually scale out and have these things be embedded in building after building, regardless of which direction you're going in. Right now, I find that I have too many conversations that seem one-off, right? Like, oh, we've heard about your work. We heard you do great things. Can we have a conversation, right? And it'll be one district in New York City, or it'll be one school district in Tennessee, or maybe, a small gathering of schools in Texas. But if we were to do this at a larger scale, and if everyone was aware, just think of what those impacts could look like. So I think it's very much around finding out what we think about equity and whole child thriving, and then what is the mindset of people around this type of work, because there's also a difference between a whole child approach and social emotional learning.
So Joel, I'm going to build on that question a little bit, especially thinking about the one school district in Tennessee or the one school district in New York, because there's been more attention on whole child approaches, right? I think like just the idea of whole child, whole family has become more of a talking point. And to your point, not everyone has the same definition of what that looks like, right? And today we're talking about the opportunity to take care of our young people and all of their complex needs, right? And recognizing that they are part of families and families are part of communities, and that where they are taken care of, whether it's a school or a childcare center, needs to do its best to respond to that complexity. That's my 10-second version of our whole child approach in this discussion. But I want to talk specifically about infrastructure. Like, what is the infrastructure that is needed? Because what we're talking about here, and we'll talk about this unique opportunity in time, we want to make sure every child in California, frankly, every child in this country, has the opportunity to be treated as their whole self, to be taken care of as their whole self. What is the infrastructure that's needed? And how are we expecting to sustain that infrastructure over time, especially as we consider whole child approaches in early learning programs, but also we've talked about community schools, we've talked about other initiatives that we know are gaining in momentum and strength by policymakers and other leaders. What is the infrastructure that our education partners need in order to sustain this type of approach?
Okay, well, I can jump in here. And I'm going to come around to it because I'm going to actually build from part of what Joel said. I think there is a mindset piece that needs to be acknowledged that then helps to create a framework and an infrastructure. So thinking systemically, thinking, whole child is a mindset that has many dimensions and can be defined in different ways. And, at its core, it's actually an ancient mindset and worldview that we're collectively paying a lot more attention to, of course, but has been very central to many cultures and societies, particularly traditional and indigenous ones. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about kind of what's most important or how we're embracing that way, and then what is the infrastructures that are needed to support it. And of course, I think it's already been mentioned here in our discussion and in other places, this notion of intersectionality. It existed before the pandemic. The pandemic has only amplified and intensified, and for some people it's an awakening, but for many of us, it's been there before, right? So really pushing ourselves to stay grounded in those notions and those mindsets that acknowledge intersectionalities, right? Race, culture, economic status, immigration status, mental health, physical health, home security, housing security, and language, right? All these things, they don't operate in a silo, and they're interconnected. And so we have to then really push ourselves not to address them as a silo and not to think about them in isolation. They don't function that way. So one of the ways that we think about it is around the alignment and coherence that children experience as they move through the grade levels, starting from early learning and into the elementary schools. And we know that working across the preschool and the K-12 system is really quite difficult. And yet the power of that experience for a child and for a family is very clear. And that when a child and a family has an aligned experience, that they can thrive in much more powerful ways. But so even though that research is clear and that the value of it is clear, the work to do it is not clear or easy by any means. These systems have very different origin stories. They've evolved very differently. The funding, the policies, the forces that work on them, the infrastructures that hold them together, very, very different. So we have to really unpack those differences and kind of think about them and think about how they're playing out for the children and families that they're meant to serve. So an example for us in our pedagogy, and we're really focused on what's happening for children in learning and in the core of schooling. We think about and really embrace the relationship between play-based learning, which is for the little ones, which is pretty widely acknowledged as so central to preschool and to early learning. The relationship between that and experiential hands-on inquiry-based learning that we hear about in NGSS and in the K-12 system. there's a relationship across those things. So dramatic play in preschool and the spaces to play and to engage that way evolve into inquiry and research centers and maybe even social action projects in elementary grades, right? There's a way that those things are connected. And then, so what does it look like for a group of educators in a school community and working across preschool and K-12 to then align their approach to these elements of learning in ways that are centralizing the children. So I think relatedly, you need to create a professional learning system and infrastructure that supports teachers to do this very complicated work. And as I shared before, and I think that example shows you, our focus is all about this kind of language and culture centered learning that's joyful, that's engaging, and that's connecting language and content. And so that's complex work. It's not a quick fix. It's not a silver bullet. It's not a plug and play app. It's not any of that, right? It's not a shrink wrapped curriculum. It's none of that. And so teachers need the time and the work to do and the support to do that, that really incredible work. And so it's not just training. Yes, important training, training is really great, but it's not alone. Training is insufficient. Teachers need to have space to come back to their schools, to do the thinking and the planning and the collaboration, to then implement and then reflect, et cetera. Coaching and team teaching are elements of a systemic professional learning system infrastructure. And yet in many school systems, those are a privilege. Those are they're not the norm at all. And yet the research is quite clear. That's what teachers need to really excel in their practice. So most educators can tell you long stories about incoherent, disjointed, flavor of the year initiatives that bring forth, that feeling of reform overload, and then leave, what's most important and devastating, leave the children without the kinds of learning and schooling experiences that really help them thrive. So I think when I think about specifically with regards to this moment, the pandemic recovery that we're in, the flood of resources and tools and desires to kind of address and to be whole child or systemic, but then still just the real danger of things becoming piled on. That, the pressures that our leaders and our politicians and our school boards and our superintendents have to just find a quick fix and make everybody feel like they're on the right path and it's all going to be okay. That we really need to resist that we need to look for ways to honor the intersectional, the ecosystemic, approaches. And then, to really, again, center assets and specifically kind of cultural and linguistically affirming approaches that can be sustained for the long haul, that aren't going to just be a flash in the pan.
Jonathan, please.
Oh my God, the mute button. I realize I keep snapping and going, yes, as Anya and Joel are talking. And I'm like, I'm muted. No one can hear me. Yes, Anya, I think trainings are great. And it's that ongoing coaching and capacity building that we really see leading to change, both at the teacher level and also at the administrative level. For example, so often these initiatives like revamping our school-wide expectations, redefining our school's value and mission statement happen with no community members at the table. And you have these conversations happening in schools located in Black and Brown communities where every face around the planning table looks like mine. And it's a huge problem. So I think a piece of it is that schools don't have the explicit training and ongoing coaching around how to engage community in these conversations and practices. How do you get folks around the table and have a conversation around what are the values that are important in your home? What are the values that keep your child safe, healthy, and well? how can we as a school community double down on that and support you in achieving the vision of success and wellness that you have for your child? And now let's get that in writing. Now let's create a policy around that. And I think I have only seen that be effective in ongoing mentor and coaching and consultation relationships with school leaders and district leaders. Anya, everything you said, like the flash in the pan initiatives, and this is what we hear from our school and district partners is, don't come and tell me something great and then leave. Please don't do it. Stay, stay with me, stay here and help me through it and help me integrate it with everything else that I'm doing. Because just as Anya said, there are so many initiatives that are really valuable and important that are existing at the same time. And often what school and district leaders need is some support in weaving all of those threads together to create the tapestry and then bring in the community voice. So it's not my tapestry, it is a vision that we have collectively created that reflects the values of the community. And Joel, I'm sorry, we had a mute war.
I mean, like this, I think this is the new normal, right? It's like almost like whack-a-mole when you were a kid. A couple of things. One, of course, mindset. I could not agree with Anya more. Just this mindset around like, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? Why is it important for kids? The second is we probably need a new mission and vision just as a sector, just for all schools, just a new mission and vision around what is it that we're trying to do. Long-term commitments with varied measures. We are not very patient, and I know schools are the focal point for impatience, right? A friend of mine asked me, she said, so when a school gets a brand new curriculum, why doesn't it take off? And I'm like, well, how long do you expect it to, like, what is your arrival date? She said, well, like 2 years. I said, do you understand when you give a new curriculum to a teacher, it's almost like learning a new language. Like it's going to take a good 4 to 5 years for them to really master that curriculum and deliver on the expectations for them, right? So if you expect something to go off in 2 years, you're probably handicapping the initiative from the jump. And if you keep doing this with your staff, they're going to burn out. So every initiative you're going to bring to them, there's going to be that eye roll in the back of their heads. Oh, we're doing this again. Just like Anya said, like flash in the pan, very theoretical. This is going to change the game. Here's the silver bullet. We're going to use this here. So that's why I say long-term commitments with varied measures, because we do have to exhibit some level of patience. Two things. One, just designing for equity. As we've pushed into schools and tried to support, what we realized was when we were there physically in the building, we became the capacity fillers as opposed to the capacity builders, right? So they would look at us and be like, well, Joel's going to figure it out. Joel knows what to do, right? Like I would literally get sent to classrooms to go help like a struggling teacher. Can you just show them how to like settle down a classroom or, have a difficult conversation? And then when you left, it felt like you left with the capacity filling yourself, right? So they kind of ended up in the same place they were before you got there. So how do we actually effectively capacity build? And we have to do that by really thinking about what the context of the school is. So when we approach a school, it's not necessarily about, oh, this is how you should structurally figure out what to do. This is the infrastructure you should put in place. But where are you right now? What are your struggles? What do you want to change about this place? Because part of our whole child design blueprint is 3 core components. You've got your developmental relationships, supportive environments, knowledge, skill, and mindset, but all of that is wrapped in shared leadership and ownership, right? Too often we are looking at principals as Morgan Freeman as Joe Clark, right? Like he's gonna come in, chain the doors, fix the school, it's gonna be amazing, and we're all gonna cry. It's gonna be great. But that's not what this is. It is very hard to move a school forward. You need all the adults in the building and all the adults outside of the building to move that building forward. So how are we actually approaching what context is? How do we help people realize what that context is? And then how do we then create those infrastructural pieces to then move forward? And then also get the community involved, because nothing is going to work without the community's input, without their buy-in, and without their continued support. So we've just been looking at the context as opposed to saying, hey, this is the prescriptive model, because that's also what happens in the ed space, where we just ask for something thinking that we can, as soon as we get our hands on it, we'll implement it and things will be better. But every context is different, every school is different, and even like we said about kids, every pathway is unique. Same thing for schools, right? So how do we actually address that context, so therefore we can build the infrastructures that we need?
You know, I really appreciate the three of you, your comments, because I think it's even challenging those of us that want to see systems change overnight, right? That, you know, we know what we're supposed to do. Why aren't we taking care of our kids better, you know, from early childhood into schools? But that urgency, that rapid response, that's an element of white dominant culture, right? That's getting forced down on us. And as I'm hearing you talk, I'm trying to push back against that myself, right? And at the same time, it is urgent for our kids, particularly our Black kids, our Latinx kids, our Native American kids, our kids of color, right? Like, it is an urgent issue. And right now we have this opportunity with tens of millions of dollars coming down the pipeline from us, from the federal government, this unique moment where we are talking about whole child approaches, and this idea that we're not going back to the status quo, because the status quo left way too many of our kids behind. So what do we do? I do appreciate that this is an individual journey, right? It's each of us that have to come to this moment where we're ready to commit to this change: teachers, administrators, parents. But given the urgency of now, given the dire situation too many of our kids have been left in, what do we do while doing our best to be patient with the process? Tell me, how do we take advantage of this opportunity, these funds, in order to make the systemic change possible? What do you see as critical to focus on in order to double down on these whole child approaches that we know will advance equity eventually?
Okay, I think the mute buttons said I could go. I think you know, we need to layer on what we know within the opportunities that lay in front of us. So, for example, in California, right now, as we speak, we're trying to develop a framework for community schools that's going to be California's framework. You know, my question is, will English learners and dual language learners be adequately centered in this framework? How will language and culture be attended to? How can we ensure that classroom learning is connected to the work of community schools, of the initiatives and programs and CBOs and resources that are going to come along? So how are we, again, creating these intersectional frameworks within the approaches that the train's already moving that direction? Similarly, for TK expansion, for this notion that we're finally close to a form of universal preschool, what is that going to look like to center the children, you know, and their families and their cultures and their languages? And how are we really going to ensure that adequate attention is given to them as assets? You know, I appreciate Mayra, because it's true. This is long-term work. This is not work that happens quickly. And yet any of us who care deeply, you know, we feel that sense of urgency, and we know a child's only 3 once. You know, a child's only can experience these things once. And so it's make or break, right? In a lot of ways. And at the same time, we have to, part of what we have to do, and I think, you know, those of us in the audience who have different kinds of leadership roles and power within, need to think about, how do we create the conditions so that these comprehensive whole school, but also long haul, the commitment that Joel was just talking about, the kind of you know, multiple players sitting around the table that Jonathan was talking about. How do we create the conditions so that work can happen? Because the conditions for schools are volatile. You know, on a regular basis, they're volatile. You know, between the politics within school boards, between the funding cycles and kind of, year to year funding cycles, between, so many layers this year, the substitute issues. And like, I've heard stories from superintendents about one Friday earlier in the fall, 50% of the staff, didn't show up. Those are conditions that are volatile. So we need to be creating conditions for the whole community and certainly the educators to be able to focus and to really understand what is their approach going to be, how am I collecting data along the way, but how am I also staying committed to approaches that feel that have research base behind them and that are intersectional and aren't siloed, kind of one-dimensional pieces.
Yes. One of the things I always think about is when administrators are creating their annual plans in the summer, to also build in opportunities to collect data specifically around equity practices. So one example of that is the Swiss system, which is a behavioral data collection system that allows administrators to be looking at what percentage of, for example, Black male students are receiving office discipline referrals throughout the week as compared or measured against their peers. And we need to invest in data systems that allow us to do this kind of reflection around equitable practices. B, we have to create a system for reviewing that data. And C, we have to bring community members, parents, and other folks in the community to the table to review that data, A, to be a thought partner with us in problem solving, and B, to hold us accountable. That we are not going to allow for trends to continue that disenfranchise groups of our students without taking a microscope to that, and then creating plans accordingly, and then progress monitoring. I think that's something that we need to sort of double down on in our summer planning and support administrators in learning how to do that and how to engage community partners in that work, including the early childhood partners in the community, to make sure, as Anya was talking about, there's that nice sort of linkage between early childhood and K-12. And I don't know what is going to be the secret sauce to support our admin and teachers in not burning out. I mean, we know, for example, in the field of social work, that coming up against systemic oppression and being a part of a system that is oppressing others and not really knowing how to affect change within it is the #1 cause of burnout for social workers. And we see that in teachers as well. And so in thinking about how do we empower teachers, admin, and community members to say, okay, I'm going into this year with a plan. I have a plan. I've got my coach to help me implement that plan. This is how I'm going to center community voices. This is how I'm going to center Black and Brown voices within this process. And is it going to go accordingly, perfect to plan? Absolutely not. As Anya said, schools are one of the most chaotic places on the planet. I love that kind of chaos. I eat it up. I love schools. But yeah, we're a chaotic group. That's just who we are. But when you have someone to keep you grounded, like a coach, like an ongoing mentor, to help you balance, yes, everything is on fire right now, and I have my long-term priorities that are rooted in the mission and vision that I've created alongside my community, and they're holding me accountable for that. I think that's how we keep the train moving.
Very quickly, one, just the moving away from white supremacy norms, just the perfectionism, the way that we grip the written word as if it is the 10 Commandments itself, the sense of urgency, like we just need to let all of that go. Just having a different radical perspective around what it looks like to empower the students that we have and the families that they come from, to be intentional, but also well-intended, right? Are we actually caring about the people that we have in the building? But are we being intentional in terms of the practices that we're trying to build in the name of equity? And also just going back to that shared leadership and ownership in which everyone is contributing to the space, but also the developmental relationships that we are supposed to be building from adult to adult, adult to child, child to child, and everyone in that building out to the school community. when COVID happened, we had actually sent out a crisis pack, if you will, around how to check in with your kids via Zoom. So they would do these things called a 2x10. So you sit with one child on Zoom for 2 minutes for 10 days in a row. And the funny thing is the school secretaries, not even the teachers, would do this with parents. And it got to the point where if they were late in calling, the parents would then call the secretaries or the teachers and say, you didn't check up on me today. Are you okay? And they would have a conversation. Like they started worrying about school staff, right? And then that relationship got stronger. And then some parents were saying, hey, I can't work right now. I'm having a very hard time feeding my family. Are there some resources you can point me to in the community that can help my family? And they were like, of course. And then the school community was then able to support the community outside of their doors. And now that relationship is much stronger. So if we can do things like that, to me, that's what equity looks like and sounds like and feels like. But we have to be very intentional about that.
I love that. I love that. Well, we are really, really close to time. We have about a couple minutes left. So if I can ask each of you, and Joel, you may have already started this, so I'm going to ask you to start. What is your call to action to those of us listening to this conversation? In your audience, you've got advocates, you've got teachers, you've got childcare providers, early learning professionals, students. Tell us, what is our call to action from where you sit on how we can advance a whole child equity approach together? For the babies, as Jonathan says, for the babies, to our students that are ready to transition into adulthood. What's the call to action? And Joel, I'm going to start with you.
Sure. Hit the reset button. Like if your computer isn't working, you turn it off and you turn it back on again and it works. This is kind of what we need to do in the ed space. We just need to start over. And the call to action for everybody is for us to start over together with a whole child purpose and a whole child design in mind for the students that we care so much about. We should be leading with empathy. We should be leading with perspective of others. We should be leading with authentic and genuine care. And then using all those other elements that we do have, like Jonathan talking about, like those measures and that data and like all those things we can like learn from and then implement. And Anya just taking I like how Anya talks. So she's from the orchestra where I'm sitting in the front row to the balcony from the back seat, right? And I can see the entire thing. And if we are able to actually lead with empathy and a whole child purpose and just say, we're going to do different and we're going to do better, then I think we can actually do that. We just need to let go of the old ways of how we think schools should be designed and what they are supposed to be doing for our students and just take on a new approach. So be bold, take on a new approach.
Anya or Jonathan, who's gonna?
I was waiting on this little unmute button, but I'll go ahead. I think I would say to create more space and opportunity for schools to articulate and ground in their unique approach to whole child education with that ongoing support. Again, the tools exist, they're out there. But what works in school A is not going to work in school B. I think we really need to empower folks to create, what does this mission and vision look like here in my space, in my community? And how do I ensure that that is delivered effectively and then it moves the needle for kids? So any and everything we can do to create those spaces and opportunities for schools.
Excellent.
So in California, one of, if not our greatest strength and asset is our diversity. And so in our state, my bold call to action is that we really center and honor that diversity of language and culture, all children's diversity, language and culture, that when there's a mismatch between school and community, it's devastating to children. 3-year-olds feel it immediately, and they stop speaking their own language to their own parents and grandparents because they feel that mismatch. So we have to honor and center language and culture in all that we do. We have to create affirming approaches, strength-based, funds of knowledge. In California, we have an incredible opportunity. We have a policy context that is so different than 10 years ago, than 7 years ago. I mean, it's been changing year in year. And yet we have this incredible and devastating reality and equity gaps and opportunity gaps. And so what does it mean to show the nation and the world what it means to be an equity-minded state, and what an equity-minded educational system can look like. So community schools, TK expansion, our LCAPs need to show, our communities these approaches. We need to see ECE prioritized and paid for with LCAP dollars. We need all the RFPs for all the state dollars coming and federal dollars coming in to really name this importance of centering language and culture and creating the coherence that I think we've all talked about.
I love that. Thank you, Anya. Thank you, Joel. Thank you, Jonathan. I think all of us that listen to this conversation are walking away knowing that if we hit the reset button, if we recognize our greatest strength is our diversity, and we create space and opportunity to do things our unique way, we're going to lead the way forward for our children in a more equitable, in a more centered way of valuing their diversity. And we couldn't have done that without you. So appreciate this conversation and the work that each of you are doing to make our spaces for children that much better.